Hi, and welcome to Recognizably Jewish, the podcast about Jewish culture. I'm your host, Jason Spitelnik. This is episode 8, Klezmer. When you hear that music, you know it's Jewish. You can feel it in your bones. But why? It's not like melodies, instrumentation, or other musical details are prescribed by the Torah. It's not like there's some Jewish gene for distinguishing Jewish-sounding music from other music. So why is it that particular music sounds so recognizably Jewish? I'm really excited about today's episode for two reasons. First, I've always had an affinity for klezmer music. It's sort of imbued with a sense of cultural pride, and it's been a real joy getting to learn more about it for this episode. And second, this episode is the first in what will be an informal series of episodes, culminating with an episode about Fiddler on the Roof. By the time we get there, I think you'll have a deep appreciation for Fiddler as an extraordinary work of recognizably Jewish culture. As always, I want to ask a favor of you before we get started. Please subscribe to and rate the podcast wherever you listen, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or elsewhere. It only takes a second, and it really helps promote the podcast to a wider audience. Please also follow our Instagram page and subscribe to receive our totally free Substack newsletter. And if you like this episode, please share it with your friends, families, and communities. With that out of the way, let's dive in. Part 1. The meaning of klezmer. Let's start by getting a definition on the table. When people refer to klezmer today, they generally mean a particular instrumental music tradition that developed among Ashkenazi Jewish people of Central and Eastern Europe. But referring to the music or to that tradition as klezmer is actually a 20th century development. The term klezmer is a Yiddish word with a Hebrew derivation. The Hebrew word klei means tools or instruments, and the Hebrew word zemer means melody or song. So the two-word phrase klei zemer came to refer to tools or instruments for making melodies or songs, that is to say, musical instruments. Over time, in the specifically Yiddish-speaking context of the Pale of Settlement and broader Ashkenazi Europe, the two-word Hebrew phrase became the single Yiddish word klezmer. And that word came to refer not to the instruments and not to the music itself, but to the musicians who played those instruments. The earliest known written uses of the word are from 16th century documents from Krakow and Prague. For several hundred years, the word klezmer referred to the musicians themselves, to the klezmorim. It's time for today's Yiddish phrase. You know the drill. I'll say a phrase in Yiddish, you try to figure out what it means. I'll reveal the answer at the end of the episode. Today's Yiddish phrase is Aus das Mädel kann nicht tanzen, zeugt sie aus die Klezmer können nicht spielen. Part 2. Before klezmer. Jewish music existed in Europe well before klezmer emerged. Jewish instrumental music flourished during the Italian Renaissance, when aristocratic families often hired Jews to teach their children how to play instruments. In Greater Germany, where the rabbis exercised more control than in Italy, Jewish music tended to be simpler and was generally limited to Jewish celebrations like Simchat Torah, Purim, Hanukkah, and most importantly, weddings. I don't want to give the impression that there were firm regional boundaries. European history shows that whenever political upheaval occurs, it leads to Jewish migration. And we know that over the course of centuries, many Jewish musicians fled south to the Ottoman Empire, the Balkans, and the Black Sea region. There, they encountered Roma musicians and were profoundly influenced by their tuning and playing styles. Some of those Jews ended up back in the Pale of Settlement, and even today, hundreds of years later, you can distinctly hear the similarities between Roma music and klezmer. In any event, over time, these medieval Jewish musicians, wherever they were, began to incorporate other talents into their acts, including magic tricks, tumbling, clowning, comedic dancing, and general merrymaking. Such an all-purpose performer became known as a letz, which is Hebrew for a clown or a jester. They were also called marshaliks. The titles were somewhat interchangeable, but they both referred to a person who entertained at joyous occasions, especially weddings. Remember, the word klezmer still meant the instruments, not the players. So an early letz or marshalik would play a klezmer, an instrument. There isn't any consensus about when the term klezmer began to denote the Jewish musician rather than the instrument he played, but it's clear that referring to klezmer musicians had become widespread by the early 18th century. The first known Yiddish songbook, published in 1707, uses the word klezmerim to refer to musicians rather than instruments. Part 3. The Jewish Wedding. Over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, the industry of Jewish entertainment professionals grew increasingly structured and specialized. Whereas a letz or a marshalik was an all-purpose entertainer who played instruments and also performed in other ways, eventually the musical role became largely distinct from the comedic entertainer role. The entertainer or master of ceremonies evolved into a position called the bodkin, which I'd like to talk about in a future episode. And the musical role became specialized in the klezmerim. I think it's worth pausing for a moment to talk about what Jewish weddings were like in and around the Pale of Settlement in the 18th and 19th centuries. A wedding wasn't something that happened in a day. It was a week-long celebration, and the preparations took a month or more. 4 weeks before the wedding, while clothes were sewn, klezmer musicians played lively dances and special songs for the bride. During the 7 days before the wedding itself, when the bride and groom were supposed to remain at home, musicians would visit their homes and play music to pass the time. 2 days before the wedding, a meal was given in honor of the groom, and the klezmerim provided musical entertainment. The evening before the wedding, the bride was led to the mikveh, accompanied by her female relatives and friends, as well as by, you guessed it, klezmer musicians. On the wedding day itself, the klezmerim were extremely busy. There was the groom's tish and the bride's bezetzin, bevenin, and bedekin, all before the processional to the chuppah began. As soon as the groom shattered the glass with his foot, the klezmerim broke out into lively dances, leading the wedding guests to the reception. And at the reception, the musicians played slow, plaintive music while the guests ate, and various styles of dance music for lively entertainment. Dancing often lasted until daybreak. Part 4. Musical characteristics of klezmer. Klezmer is a rich musical tradition. In its heyday, it varied greatly from region to region and from group to group. I want to walk through some of the most common aspects of klezmer music, but I don't want to give the impression that klezmer was some sort of monolithic musical style. It was folk music, and all folk music evolves with local customs and traditions. By the late 18th century, most klezmer musicians were organized into groups known as kapelliers. These kapelliers were often dynastic enterprises consisting of male members of a family from multiple generations. Each kapellier had its own characteristic style. The size of the kapellier depended on the size of the wedding, with wealthier families able to pay for larger and more ornate musical operations. But even for smaller weddings with poorer brides, it was considered important to have a klezmer kapellier. Let's talk about the instruments. The violin was invented in Italy around 1550 and made its way into European Jewish shtetls around 1700. Soon thereafter, it became the most prominent instrument in most klezmer kapelliers. The violin's sonority was closely identified in the tradition with the human voice. And most kapelliers were named after their first violinist, who played lead melodies and the most virtuosic parts of any given song. An instrument called the cymbal, or cymbalum, was a vital part of klezmer in the 19th century, but it's less well known today. It's a resonant soundboard stringed instrument played by hitting the strings with 2 percussion mallets or beaters. If you're familiar with the modern hammered dulcimer, you get the gist of the cymbal. Michael Joseph Guzico was an early 19th century cymbalist who became widely famous and admired. Franz Liszt saw him play in Paris and wrote a gushing letter about the experience. Today, when you think of klezmer, you probably think of the leading part being played by a clarinet rather than a violin. But the clarinet wasn't invented until the early 1700s and didn't become popular among klezmerim until the mid 19th century. That said, it has become probably the most central instrument in modern klezmer orchestration. In addition to these prominent leading instruments, klezmer capelliers also featured musicians playing flute, bass, other brass parts, and basic percussion instruments like woodblocks and snare drums. Modern klezmer often features prominent accordions. So those are the instruments. But what were those capelliers playing at weddings and other simchas? What made klezmer music stand apart from other European folk music played on similar Western instruments? There isn't a simple or definitive answer, but a few things are definitely worth mentioning. First, as Hasidic Judaism flourished in Eastern Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, musicians were melodically influenced by Hasidic nigunim. A nigun is a vocal song featuring a prominent melody and often involving repetitive improvisational sounds. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, promoted the adoption of nigunim as spiritual musical vehicles. Those tunes, which were focused on melody rather than lyrical content, were easily adopted and adapted by instrumental klezmer musicians. Second, and relatedly, klezmer has a characteristic musical mode or set of scales. Much klezmer music is played using what's known as the Phrygish scale. The word Phrygish is a Yiddish interpretation of the word Phrygian, and non-Yiddish speakers would refer to the Phrygish scale as the Phrygian dominant. Here's a simple Phrygish scale. That scale alone is enough to give the overall impression of klezmer or even of Jewish music to a listener. Third, klezmer is characterized by a certain virtuosic or ornamented style of play. To give a song a proper klezmer sound, a player has to know how to incorporate what are known as dreidelach, specific musical twists, turns, and ornamentations. The dreidelachs included glitchin, kanachin, and choks, but the principal example is the use of krechts. The word itself is Yiddish for a wail or a moan or a complaint. A klezmer musician forms a krekt using grace notes and musical stops to mimic the catch in the voice sound of a wailing cantor singing. The krekt was, in many ways, the cornerstone of the Jewish musical sound. It signaled an outbreak of ecstatic joy and was a source of exaltation and pleasure for masses of European Jews. Okay, we've talked about capelliers, the instruments they played, and some key characteristics of their music. Now we need to talk about the klezmer repertoire. In the glory days of klezmer, there were dozens upon dozens of different styles and song types. They varied regionally, but also had different uses. The Bulgarish was a common general-purpose dance tune. The Pleskin was a dance for women encircling the bride. The Gosnigan was played for newlyweds and their guests after wedding celebrations, etc. The best-known varieties of klezmer songs persisting until today are known by the Yiddish names Freilichs and Doina. Think of Freilichs as upbeat music with hard driving rhythms conducive to group circle dances and other energetic occasions. Doina, by contrast, is a more reflective, meditative musical form, often played directly for the bride and groom to inspire them with spiritual feelings on their wedding day. What I hope you'll take away from this overview is that klezmer was and still is a heterogeneous folk musical tradition. It's tied together by certain common cultural and musical elements, and most of all by its specifically Jewish cultural context, but it defies simplistic definition or categorization. Part 5: Klezmer's Decline. So, what happened to klezmer? Why do most people think about it as an almost ancient art form? Well, it continued to play an important role in European Jewish ritual life throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th. Eventually, though, it was caught up in macro trends that influenced all aspects of European Judaism. The Haskalah movement, which culminated with the development of Reform Judaism, meant many more Jews were assimilated into local cultures and didn't seek out specifically Jewish music and entertainment at weddings or for other notable occasions. And eventually, economic hardship, unrelenting Jew hatred, and outright pogroms led many Jews, especially younger ones, to emigrate first to more urban settings in Europe and then to points abroad, including Palestine and most notably, the United States. Whereas Jews had generally lived in somewhat homogenous communities in the Old Country, in the US they lived in big cities and had access to other musical styles and influences: theater, vaudeville, amusement parks, dance halls, restaurants. Virtually none of these things existed in European shtetls, but they were plentiful in Manhattan and Brooklyn. Weddings had been the bread and butter gig for klezmerim in Europe, but weddings weren't the same in America. They weren't week-long multi-venue celebrations involving broad swaths of the community. Instead, they were generally held on a single day in a social or catering hall. Sometimes those venues had house bands. Klezmer performances became relegated to places like catering halls, Yiddish theaters, and entertainment venues in the Catskills. The anthology Hebrew International Wedding Music was published in 1916, followed by several books that became go-to sources for klezmer musicians in the US. The publication of these books was significant in several ways. First, it meant that for the first time in history, non-Jewish musicians could easily learn the songs and play klezmer gigs. Second, it captures the changing instrumentation that was occurring in klezmer as it adapted to the US environment, including using piano or accordion instead of cymbal and lead clarinet rather than violin. There were some Jewish klezmer musicians who became commercially successful. Two clarinetists that bear mentioning are Dave Terrace, born David Terechuk, and Naftali Brandwein. But despite occasional commercial success, klezmer remained a niche genre in the early 20th century musical landscape in the US. In time, klezmer grew entirely out of fashion. Jews assimilated into the rising middle class. They left the Lower East Side for Brooklyn and the Bronx, and eventually for the suburbs. They had pianos in their homes, and their children learned American piano tunes instead of klezmer violin melodies. Fewer people spoke Yiddish, and fewer people still listened to klezmer. Meanwhile, in Europe, Jewish communities were destroyed, first by the Holocaust and later by Soviet oppression. The cultural fountain of the Old World was shut off for good. Even in the nascent state of Israel, there was little appetite for klezmer. The Jews of the Yishuv were establishing their own national identity, one that often stood in opposition to the traditions of the Old Country. Just as many Jews who moved to Palestine and then to Israel replaced their European surnames with Hebrew ones, the Jewish community in Israel replaced outmoded European musical traditions like klezmer with new styles like Shirei Eretz Yisrael.
ימין ושמאל, רק חול וחול, יצאי מדבר ללא משעול.
In the middle of the 20th century, outside of Hasidic enclaves, klezmer was largely a nostalgic or vestigial musical tradition. Even Jewish musicians didn't know the klezmer repertoire. Part 6. The Klezmer Revival. 1964 saw the Broadway debut of the musical Fiddler on the Roof, based on the Yiddish-language Tevye stories by Sholem Aleichem. Jerry Bach, who wrote the music, incorporated aspects of klezmer into the score, including Frege scales, nigun-inspired tunes, and familiar klezmer instrumentation. For many people, including many American Jews, Fiddler was one of their first exposures to the klezmer sound. Fiddler was of a piece with the growth of identity politics and the popularization of folk and traditional music and culture in the 1960s. In a way, the 60s set the stage for klezmer to return to popular consciousness, and it did. In the 70s and 80s, numerous younger, mostly Jewish musicians were inspired to reconnect with a nearly forgotten musical tradition. Some found mentorship from the older generation, including Dave Terrace and Max Epstein. Many learned from old recordings. They reconnected with their roots, but also incorporated elements of jazz, rock, and other ethnic genres. In 1985, ethnomusicologist and radio producer Henry Sapoznik started the Yiddish Folk Art Institute, better known as KlezCamp, an annual Yiddish culture and klezmer music festival in the Catskills. And in New York City in the 90s, the Knitting Factory and Tonic became important clubs for alternative music scenes, including the klezmer revival. Multicultural klezmer ensembles emerged in the US and all over the Western world, playing not just the rediscovered old repertoire, but modern songs inspired by klezmer musical modes and qualities. Here's a fun piece by Dave Krakauer. And here's a clip of the band Tanz going hard. Thanks for listening this far. I really love klezmer, and I hope you'll walk away from this episode with a deeper appreciation of this beautiful folk music tradition. Please rate and review the podcast, like and subscribe wherever you can, and share this episode with friends, families, and communities. Before I finish, let's not forget this episode's Yiddish phrase. Os das Mädel kann nicht tanzen, soigt sie klezmer, nennen nicht spielen. If a girl can't dance, she says the musicians can't play. With that, thanks for listening to Recognizably Jewish.